Hello and welcome to episode 6 of my mostly stock career. Now today what we're going to be doing right off the bat is launching into a rendezvous with our encounter because we're going to be saving another Kerbal. Now if you don't remember last time we left off, whereas we just returned from the lunar landing with a bunch of science, we had bought some stuff and then we had planned to complete the contract that we didn't quite complete in episode 4. So we're going to be doing that, as well as taking a tourist on a suborbital trajectory, whom is very scared if you actually look at his little portrait when we go back into the actual flight screen. If we go back long enough. This is all post-commentary because we've seen launches before. Now, I'm actually launching somewhat to an encounter. It's actually a pretty bad one, since I had launched a little late. I'm still working on the timing, and mostly since I launched a little late, the encounter actually was quite awful. However, eventually I do manage to get into the encounter, which does allow me to, of course, rendezvous pretty efficiently. It could have been better if I had launched maybe 30 seconds earlier, but it'll have to do for what I have. Of course, if your rendezvous actually ends up being rather poor, you can always just burn towards the target so that your prograde vector is moving toward the target, meaning you are moving toward the target, so that eventually an encounter will be guaranteed. As you can see, I have a decent encounter, not the best, although it's also very highly inefficient since, like I said, I did manage to waste a lot of fuel simply because I launched a little too late and I still wanted to try and launch to an encounter. But I have plenty of fuel to spare, so it doesn't actually harm me all that much. Now again, this is just a standard rendezvous, where you make your prograde vector, the position you're moving toward. You just point it towards your target, move toward the target, cancel out the velocity, and of course, when you're pretty close, you can actually just encounter them. Now, one thing I was doing there, just kind of noting, is you pull your prograde vector on the nav ball and you push your retrograde vector. So if the retrograde vector, you're pointing towards it and it's moving away from the target, you can actually push the retrograde vector back onto the target. Of course, you'll be slowing down some in the process, but you will also be still moving towards the target, so you can refine your kind of distance without having to point forward again. We'll do plenty more with encounters when we create orbital stations, so we'll kind of go over all of those mechanics then. But we've already kind of seen the basics of this, so I was kind of speeding through it. Now, if you noticed, I created a nice maneuver node that's kind of moving us to where I want to go, since I have to land pretty close to that marker there on Kerbal so that I can take the crew report. Now, what I'm actually doing is the way I'm burning right now is kind of strange, and what it is I'm slowing down my orbital velocity. I'm burning retrograde, but I'm also burning outward, meaning I'm burning radial out. And the reason I'm burning radial out is because it raises my periapsis and makes my incline steeper, meaning that I have less of the lower atmosphere to encounter. It basically means I fall towards Kerbal much faster straight down, but at the same time I also can more accurately predict where I'll end up, since I have less atmospheric time, and the atmosphere is the only real unpredictable thing. So I do manage to get my crew report once I get low enough, and I use my parachute to slow down, as well as the others, just to ensure that all of the Kerbals land safely. And of course, from there, it's a pretty simple landing. Where of course, we completed all the contracts we wanted, so it was a huge mission success. And of course, we got another Kerbal, whom I did check and is another pilot for us. So we have gained a pilot, as you can see. Or you can't because it moved kind of quickly. Anyway, back to the old me. Okay, so I have just been looking at all of the various contracts that we have available to us, and we do have quite a few of them that I want to do. Although, I think what should take precedence is going to be Flyby Minmus. Mostly because a flyby on Minmus would actually give us a lot of science, since we have quite a few science experiments to do. And it also brings us kind of to the next stage, because I'm looking, before we go back to the moon, I'm kind of looking for maybe like start a moon base kind of contract, but I haven't seen any just yet, although this plant a flag does seem pretty good. So I do want to take that. We're going to do the Flyby Minmus primarily for this. So we'll take that, and I believe that's everything we can kind of do along the way. There's a lot of rescues from orbit around the moon and doing satellites, but we'll be doing the satellites probably a little bit later. As for now, our focus is going to be flying by Minmus. And also, since I looked at our cache here and we have 1 million funds, we're actually going to upgrade our research and development center now because I want access to 1 resource transfer, and I also want to be able to get surface samples, and of course primarily actually upgrade the science limit. So by upgrading the research and development center, now when I go in here, I can actually start getting these next tier of science unlocks up to 300, which is this tier up here. So I can get up to basically the nuclear tier. Until I upgrade it again, then I can get the rest of the stuff. But that gives me access to some of these larger, more useful technologies that we will be unlocking when we actually do a big scientific landing on Minmus, because there is a ton of science, and I mean a ton of it on Minmus's surface, because there are so many different biomes, and it's so easy to navigate since it's such low gravity. But anyhow, let me build something that'll give us a Minmus flyby, and we'll quickly do that for the beginning of this. Alright, so I've got this craft, which is basically the same craft I had just used. It does have a few differences, such as the engines have been rearranged as to allow the service bay to open and close, and, well, the service bay was added along with a couple scientific parts, such as the Science Bay Juniors, the goo canisters, temperature scans, and barometers, which are all in the service bay, and, of course, one of the command modules was removed because I only need the 2 Kerbals, which is both Valentina, so she can level up from this this trip, this flyby Minmus, and of course Bob, because he's the scientist and we want to get him some experience as well, and also he should be giving us more science. Alright, so this being our first time actually heading off to Minmus, one thing that you need to note is that it's on a different incline than Kerbal. So just going in the standard east 90 degrees on the nav ball, that orbit won't necessarily work for Minmus, because if you notice, there is a plane change. Now with the moon, there is no plane change, so you can easily just get to it. Although because of this plane change, you do need to be wary of it, just because it can affect how you might have to add your maneuver based on where Minmus is. But here's the thing about Minmus being on a different plane. If what's going to happen is if Minmus, you're going to encounter it at the ascending node, basically your apoapsis would follow the ascending node up, then there's no real issue. Which I could probably show better if I use the other node, since the moon is in the way. Let's add a maneuver here. So if you're going to encounter Minmus on the ascending node, then there's no need to worry about this plane change, because you can simply just encounter it at the node. However, Minmus is going to be there by the time we actually reach it, meaning that it's not going to be up on this, it's not going to be on the ascending nodes. So instead, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to use a second node, because if you look just by burning this way, we can't actually encounter it. And if we try to burn anti-normal as to move down, you'll also notice that we won't be able to encounter it that way, because burning anti-normal will only angle this. So if you look, it doesn't necessarily help all that much, because all it's going to do is actually angle the maneuver node versus actually lower the trajectory. It's actually raising the trajectory if it's doing anything. So that won't work. But instead, what we really need to do is I'm just going to allow my vessel to go past where we need to make this node. Is you need to make a node and push it out into Minmus's orbit's distance. So not necessarily encountering it, but push it out to about the distance of Minmus's orbit. And then click on your ascending node, say add maneuver, and then lower it. As you can see, just by doing that, we already have an encounter. Simply by pushing our... Now, of course, I knew it was going to be here because I did that ascending node thing. So first you need to check where you're going to encounter it based on how long it takes to get there by simply just finding the original ascending node. So we can actually delete this to show that a little bit better. Find the node, say add maneuver, and then just burn or just push the node forward prograde. And then when you get an encounter, you're going to basically be able to see that by mousing over closest approach, the separation is quite massive. And if we look here, this is the target position at the closest approach. So by the time we are able to move out into Minmus's orbit, the amount of time that it takes to get there, Minmus will have moved to there. So now knowing that Minmus is there, all we have to do is take our node, drag it to about where Minmus is going to be, make sure it still reaches because the orbit does have a little bit of difference in it. Make sure it still reaches. Then, once we've determined that it does, click our ascending node, add a maneuver, and because our node, our apoapsis is above the orbit, we pull down. If our apoapsis was below the orbit, we would pull up. Now you can see, if you mouse over, that this is the target position at our closest approach. So because it's a little off, all we can just move it to the side a little. Our second node will automatically move with it as to compensate for what our new node does. And then you can see we have an encounter. Now, if you want to do any fine-tuning for the encounter, it's best to be done on the secondary node, since the secondary node actually has more control over the actual encounter. So you can see we're still a little high. If you look, that red dot is Minmus. So if we move down a little bit more, periapsis should shrink. Of course, that's good enough for now. We'll do fine-tuning once we've completed a burn. Instead of using only maneuver nodes to determine this, we can actually complete this first one. So because I actually forgot to delete my previous nodes, I'm just deleting them all and kind of resetting them all. Of course, with the same tactic, just burning out to where I know it's going to be, creating the second node, lowering it down, and then repositioning the first node as to make sure that my encounter is accurate. And then of course I'm just fine-tuning the second node so that I can get my periapsis around Minmus low enough so that I will get the close flyby science. Just like we did with the moon, where we got our periapsis rather low so that we could get both high over Minmus, or high over the moon and low over the moon. We're going to do the same for Minmus, getting both high over Minmus and high over the moon. So once we get that all solved out and the nodes created, we just burn for our first node, as we would normally do, and then wait for the second node to occur. Now at this point I do want to make a quick note about using two maneuver nodes in sequence. Basically placing a maneuver node before you actually complete the burn. And what happens is sometimes the maneuver node will actually be off from your own trajectory if you don't do the burn super accurately. As you can see, the maneuver node is on this orange line, and the blue line is my actual orbit, and there's a very minimal discrepancy between the two. It's so small though, I'm not going to worry about it, but if you do encounter that minimal issue, all you have to do is basically delete the node, and then you'll get your new ascending node, especially for Minmus, say add maneuver, and then just lower it until of course you get your encounter. So it's the same process except using your real orbit instead of your predicted orbit. That way you don't have to worry about accidentally getting an improper burn. Now, what I actually mean by improper burn is that if you burn the maneuver node that's created on a predicted orbit rather than your real orbit, the node is assuming that you are actually following that predicted orbit. So if there's any discrepancy at all between the predicted orbit and the real orbit, the maneuver node will tell you how to get to your new position only if you are actually on the predicted orbit that it was created. So if you're following your real orbit and it's different than the predicted orbit, then the maneuver node will basically be useless and it will kind of lead you in the wrong direction. So that's pretty much what it means. Since the maneuver node was created on the predicted orbit, it's assuming that that's the orbit you actually have. So if there's any trouble with maneuver nodes, just delete them and recreate them on the real orbit you have, which is the blue line, and the maneuver node should start working again. So, now that we've actually encountered Minmus' sphere of influence for the first time, I am beginning to do all of my science. Because of course, we want to unlock as much as we can, bring it back, and of course, then buy more stuff with it. So, if you notice, currently my encounter with Minmus is straight through the planet. And I'm trying to actually click on the maneuver node to talk about this, but for some reason I wasn't able to click on the maneuver node. So what I'm doing is I'm actually burning radial out, which is the blue circle with the 4 lines kind of moving outward. And radial out basically means burn away from the planet, which if you're going to crash into the planet, burning radial out will stop you, since it will cause you to burn against the planet, meaning that instead of having your orbit go straight through it, your orbit will then kind of be pushed outward to actually resemble a real orbit, just like I did. So just like with the moon flyby, we of course are having Bob here, doing lots of EVA reports, trying to get as many as he can. And I managed to get 3 different EVA reports, lowlands, midlands, and slopes from Minmus, which are just 3 of the biomes. There are many more biomes, such as all of the greater flats. There's the greater flats, and I think each one of the different flatbeds are their own biome, which means you can get surface samples and of course goo experiments and Science Bay Juniors from each of the different flatbeds. So just because of that, there is a lot of science on Minmus, not to mention highlands, lowlands, midlands, and slopes, and the poles, which makes tons of biomes, especially when you're getting about 150 to 200 science per surface sample. Anyway, what happens is we gather our science, we move away from Minmus and leave its sphere of influence, and then of course I just burn retrograde. But at this time, I just want to check something really quick at the KSC, Kerbal Space Center, and that is if there was any new contracts, and I did manage to get one, which was recover scientific data from space around Minmus, which is really convenient because we just picked up a whole bunch of scientific data from space around Minmus. And now that we have that, it's time to land. Now, the landing of this craft is actually different than most. I figured I'd change it up a little bit. Normally I just bring the crew pod back, but this time I'm actually going to bring all of the scientific experiments back. So I let go of 2 drop pods, which were just holding fuel, and this vessel had so much extra fuel I literally didn't even have to use my last stage, which is what I just activated now. So I'm just slowing down. I dropped that once we lost control because it was no longer of use to us. If we can't control the craft, then there's no point in really having the engine. And then of course I deployed the 1 chute to act as kind of a drogue chute, which will slow us down a little bit, and then the other 4 chutes to actually make us safely fall into the water. And I was a little hesitant, thinking that the water might do something weird with the service module and destroy all my science experiments. However, I was impressed that it didn't. 488 science from that one little flyby mission. I'd have to say that that is pretty good. And of course we got some additional science from some of the contracts we did. And Valentina is advanced to level 2 and Bob is on his way. So we got 3 science from the contract that we had just barely picked up. Of course we have more of these launch clamps over here that just kind of get left behind. And let's see if there's anything new. Well, Orbit Minmus, we're going to be doing that eventually. So why not grab it? And this one's actually quite valuable. Do a bunch of scans. Plan to flag on Minmus since we will be landing there pretty soon. Maybe next, maybe not. Let's actually grab plant to flag. Position satellites in specific orbits. Let's actually grab this one. We'll go to Minmus. We'll plan a landing mission as well as we'll plan a small lander that'll hop around and do all of these. So let's grab this one and we're going to do a big Minmus mission next time. But first, before we end this, let's actually grab onto some science because we have all of the new science, which means we can get tons of new parts. And I am actually... Let's see, this is... What's its max thrust? 2.0 in a vacuum. What about this thing? 2.0. Okay, so it's equivalent thrust, except this one's radial. Alright, so for the research we're going to grab is we want the mobile processing lab because we want to begin to get more from our science, basically. So we're going to be grabbing this one. And what we're going to spend the last 410 on is probably... Oh, that's another science experiment. I don't know if I want more science experiments or more parts. Let's see. Let's finish up the 90 research as to gain access to the upper tier. And I'm thinking that maybe docking ports right here would be a good choice, since it'll allow us to start actually creating stations. Yeah. Let's grab docking ports. When we get 20 more science, probably from a miscellaneous type thing that we do, we'll be able to unlock this, which will give us a couple more parts, or of course we can just save up for the larger tech. But for now we're just going to unlock basically the rest of the 90 tech parts and primarily get this mobile processing lab because it'll allow us to better make use of the science we get, because we can actually put the science we get, some of the data from the science we get, into the lab and then get more science from that data. It's a pretty interesting process. And with our new tech achieved, this will be the end of episode 6 of my mostly stock career. I thank you guys for watching. This is PTT GRW, signing out.